She was 8 months pregnant when her billionaire husband's hands closed around her throat. He whispered, "You'll never win against me." But Grace Ashford had a secret weapon he never saw coming: his own mother, a supposedly dead business partner, and a plan so perfect it would put him behind bars for 25 years. This is the true story of how one woman brought down an empire built on lies. If this resonates with you, show some love with a like. Comment below, what would you do in her position? And subscribe. These stories of survival and justice don't tell themselves. Hit that bell so you never miss one. Let's get into it. On the night Victor Ashford toasted his empire's success before 300 of Manhattan's elite, his pregnant wife delivered a gift that would destroy him in 72 hours. Inside that velvet envelope sat proof that the man he murdered was alive. The Fifth Avenue Plaza Hotel glittered on Christmas Eve. Grace Ashford stood at the edge of the ballroom, one hand resting on her 8-month belly, the other clutching sparkling water everyone mistook for champagne. In white silk and diamonds, she looked like the perfect billionaire's wife. It was the greatest performance of her life. Across the room, Victor commanded attention in custom Armani, accepting applause as he announced a $50 million donation to children's hospitals, money stolen from pension funds through shell companies in Zurich. Grace's phone buzzed. "He's here, ready when you are. E." She found Elliot Nash near the bar, partially hidden behind a marble column. 5 years had weathered his boyish charm into something harder. His beard was fuller, streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp, watching Victor with the intensity of a man who had crawled out of hell for this moment. Victor finished his speech to thunderous applause. Isabel Crane slipped through the crowd in her red dress, touching Victor's arm with casual possession. Grace made her way to the exit. In the marble restroom, she pulled out her phone and watched the video one more time. Security footage from 5 years ago. Victor's voice, unmistakable. "If you expose the Zurich accounts, you'll disappear. Accidents happen at sea. Elliot." 2 days later, Elliot Nash's sailboat capsized 20 miles off Maine. Nobody recovered. Victor gave a tearful eulogy and transferred $12 million from their shared accounts before Elliot's estate could be settled. Grace returned to the ballroom. Victor appeared at her side. "You look tired. Maybe you should head home early." His fingers tightened on her hip, reminding her of last week's bruise. "I insist. Think about the baby." The baby he planned to take from her. She knew because she had copied his emails. All of them. "Of course," Grace said softly. "You're right." As she walked toward the exit, she caught Elliot's eye. He gave the smallest nod. Phase 1 complete. The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Grace went to Victor's study and opened his wig with his mother's birthday, the password he used for everything. Inside was everything she needed. Account statements, offshore banking passwords in Victor's handwriting, a burner phone, photographs of women who were not his wife. Grace photographed each document, uploading them to a secure cloud drive. Then she sat in his leather chair and waited. He came home at 3 a.m., reeking of Isabel's perfume and scotch. The lights were off except for the projector Grace had set up. "Grace, what are you doing in here?" She pressed play. The security footage filled the wall. Victor's voice threatening Elliot's death. Then photos of offshore accounts, bank transfers, forged signatures, and finally the photograph that made Victor freeze. Elliot Nash, alive, standing on a beach, holding yesterday's newspaper. "I have a Christmas gift for you, Victor," Grace said quietly. Victor moved faster than she expected. He grabbed the laptop and hurled it against the wall. Glass exploded across the floor. "You stupid bitch." His voice was ice. "You think this matters?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand closing around Grace's throat. The chair tipped backward. She hit the floor hard, curling to protect her belly. "That recording, I'll bury it. I'll bury you in lawsuits until our kid graduates college." Grace's vision blurred. The baby kicked frantically. She tried to speak but could only gasp. Victor released her suddenly, smoothing his jacket. "Go to bed, Grace. We'll discuss this when you're thinking clearly." She stayed on the floor, one hand on her throat, the other on her belly. This was not how it was supposed to go. "I said go to bed." His voice was quieter now, more terrifying. Grace pulled herself up slowly, pain shooting through her back. She made it to the guest bedroom before her legs gave out. Sinking onto the bed, She finally allowed herself to sob. The baby moved again. Smaller kicks now. Exhausted. Grace pressed both hands to her belly, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. But lying alone in the dark, throat aching and back throbbing, Grace wondered if she had just signed both their death warrants. Grace woke to 3 missed calls from her attorney, Benjamin Cross. She had retained him 2 weeks ago, quietly, paying his retainer from a secret account Victor didn't know about. Benjamin's Midtown office was small, professional. Grace. His expression shifted from professional warmth to concern when she entered, scarf wrapped around her bruised neck. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Did you review the documents?" Benjamin gestured to printouts spread across his desk. "This is extraordinary. The audio alone is potentially criminal evidence. The financial documents prove fraud on a massive scale. With Elliot Nash's testimony, you have everything you need." Grace felt hope loosen in her chest. "Victor will settle," Benjamin continued. "He's looking at 20 years if this goes to trial. He'll give you full custody, substantial settlement, whatever you want to keep this quiet." "How long, Bob?" "File today, settlement conference within the month. By February, this could be over." Grace closed her eyes, imagining freedom, safety. "File the papers." Benjamin nodded. "Change your locks today. Stay with family if you can. Men like Victor become dangerous when cornered." Grace left feeling lighter than she had in months. Outside, the city sparkled with Christmas decorations. She paused at a baby boutique, letting herself look at tiny clothes. Soon, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mrs. Ashford, this is Helen Garrett from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. We need to speak with you about evidence regarding Victor Ashford." Grace's heart hammered. "I haven't filed a police report. We're aware, Psimo, but based on financial irregularities that came to our attention, we're opening an investigation. Your cooperation would be valuable." Criminal charges meant Victor couldn't simply pay his way out. When today, if possible, this afternoon, Grace spent the afternoon walking prosecutors through bank statements and audio files. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to sharp interest. When she emerged at sunset, her phone exploded with messages. Then Benjamin called. His voice was wrong, tight, frightened. "Grace, I'm so sorry." 4 words that shattered everything. "Benjamin, what happened?" "Victor has information about me, about a sealed case from 20 years ago. He's threatened to make it public. File complaints with the Bar Association." "I'll lose my license. I have children, a mortgage." Grace hung up before he could finish. She called every attorney on her list, 8 names. One by one, they all said the same thing. "No, I cannot take your case." Victor had gotten to them all. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Billionaire Victor Ashford files defamation suit against estranged wife, seeking damages and full custody of unborn child. The article included a statement claiming Grace's apparent mental health crisis. Grace tried to check her bank account. Frozen. Legal hold pending the defamation suit. She had $47 in cash. The baby kicked. Hard. Then again. Then the cramping started. She barely made it to the bathroom before the contraction hit, so intense it drove her to her knees. "Not yet. Please, not yet." Grace called an Uber because she couldn't afford an ambulance. The emergency room was crowded with holiday injuries. Grace waited, doubled over, timing contractions that came too fast and too early. Dr. Catherine Pierce finally examined her. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high. The stress is threatening your baby. If we cannot get this under control, we may need to induce labor early." "I'm only 32 weeks, Grace whispered. "I know, which is why you need to tell me what's causing this level of stress. My husband is trying to destroy me." "Then you need to leave him." "I'm trying, but he owns them all. Every lawyer, every judge, every person who could help me." Dr. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled up a chair. "My sister had a husband like that. When she finally tried to leave, he nearly killed her. She survived because she stopped fighting alone. I am alone." "Are you—" Grace's phone buzzed. Text from Elliot. "I heard what happened. I'm coming to you. We finished this together." Grace read it 3 times, and something in her chest finally took a breath. "No," she said to Dr. Mo. Pierce, I'm not alone. The doctor kept her overnight for observation. Your blood pressure is stabilizing, but the baby needs 6 more weeks. Bed rest, low stress, no contact with people who make your blood pressure spike. My husband will find me here. Not if the hospital has no record of your admission. Danny Pierce met her eyes. Sometimes patient privacy means protecting more than medical information. After the doctor left, Grace lay in darkness, listening to her daughter's heartbeat through the fetal Doppler. Outside, Bolanen, the city celebrated Christmas. Inside, Ewapara, Grace Ashford prepared for war. Elliot arrived at dawn, slipping into Grace's hospital room like a shadow. You look terrible, he said. You look dead, she countered. I was. Resurrection takes it out of you. He pulled up the visitor's chair. How's the baby? Stubborn. Takes after her mother? Grace shifted in bed. Victor froze my accounts. Every lawyer in Manhattan won't touch my case. He's filing for custody, claiming I'm mentally unstable. I know. I've been monitoring his communications. Elliot pulled out a laptop. He's called in favors from 3 judges, 2 politicians, the deputy police chief. He's building a fortress. Then how do we break it? We don't break it. We burn it down. He turned the screen toward her, a photograph of Isabel Crane, caught in surveillance footage, arguing with someone off camera. I've been following her for 3 weeks. Your husband's mistress isn't as happy as her Instagram suggests. He promised her Monaco after your divorce. But last week, he was in Paris with a different woman. Hotel security footage, credit card records, the works. Grace studied the image. Isabel looks smaller, without designer clothes and professional lighting. You think she'll flip on him? No. I think she's 27 and just realized she's been played. Yeah, I'll flip. They spent the morning planning. Elliot had 5 years of evidence. Bank statements, recordings, timelines connecting Victor to fraud, bribery, and attempted murder. The boat didn't sink by accident, Elliot explained. Victor had someone tamper with the fuel line. I got lucky a fishing boat found me before hypothermia finished the job. Why didn't you go to police? I tried, but Victor had already planted evidence showing I was embezzling, made it look like I faked my death to avoid prosecution. I had no proof, no credibility, so I disappeared for real and spent 5 years building an unbreakable case. What changed? I saw the pregnancy announcement. I knew what kind of father Victor would be. I couldn't let that happen. Grace felt something shift in her chest. You risked everything to protect a child you've never met. I'm risking everything to stop a man who should never have power over anyone. They were interrupted by a knock. A nurse entered. Mrs. Ashford, there's a gentleman here. Says he's your husband. Grace's blood pressure spiked, setting off alarms. The nurse frowned at the monitor. Maybe this isn't a good time. Tell him I'm sleeping, that I can't have visitors. After the nurse left, Elliot was already moving. He can't know I'm here. Victor's pushing for an emergency custody hearing, Elliot said, claiming you're endangering the baby by refusing prenatal care. It's scheduled for 3 days after New Year's. That's less than a week, which means we move now, tonight, Isabel first, then we build from there. Grace was discharged the next morning with strict bed rest instructions. Dr. Pierce handed her a folder containing discharge papers and her personal cell phone number. If you need anything at all. They drove to Isabel's Chelsea apartment. The influencer answered in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, face bare of makeup. Without Instagram filters, she looked almost ordinary. Young, tired. You brought her, my show. Isabel's eyes fixed on Grace's pregnant belly. Inside her pristine apartment, suitcases sat half-packed by the door. He's leaving me, Isabel said without preamble. Texted this morning. Said things were complicated. That he needed space. He's been planning this for months, Elliot said, showing her the timeline. Victor's Paris affair had started 6 months ago. There were others too. A pattern of women, each lasting about a year before being discarded. Isabel's hands shook, scrolling through evidence. I thought I was different. You were just next in line, Grace said quietly. He's very good at making people believe they're special. I didn't know he was married when we met. He said you were separated. It wasn't. I know that now. Isabel looked up. What do you want from me? The truth. Elliot said, in court, on record, everything he told you, everything you saw. He'll destroy me. He's already destroying you, Grace pointed out. At least this way, you take him down with you. Isabel was quiet, staring at Victor's breakup text. Finally, she nodded. They spent 2 hours recording her testimony. She detailed Victor's schemes, bribes she witnessed, threats to business rivals. She produced texts showing Victor paid her $500,000 to keep Grace distracted during pregnancy. He wanted you isolated, Isabel explained. Said if you had no friends, no support, it would be easier to prove you were unstable when the custody fight started. Grace felt ice in her veins. That was his plan from the beginning. He was very clear about wanting children on his terms. Isabel wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, for what it's worth. Grace didn't forgive her. But she understood they had both been pawns. There's one more thing, Elliot said. We need you wired for the New Year's Eve gala. Isabel's eyes widened. You want me to get him to confess? We want you to make him angry enough to tell the truth. Can you do that? She looked at Grace, at the suitcases, at the life built on lies. Yeah, I can do that. They left with hours of testimony and a plan that was equal parts brilliant and desperate. This might work, Grace said finally. It has to work, Elliot replied, because we're out of backup plans. That evening, Grace's phone rang. Unknown number. Mrs. Ashford, this is Agent Thomas Reed with the FBI. We need to speak about your husband's financial activities. Another player entering the game. When? Tomorrow, my office, 10 a.m. Grace hung up and sat in gathering darkness. Outside, the city prepared for New Year's Eve. Inside, Grace Ashford prepared for the fight of her life. The FBI office in Federal Plaza smelled of old coffee and crushed ambitions. Agent Thomas Reed was younger than Grace expected, maybe 40, with careful eyes. Thank you for coming, Miss Ashford. Grace sat, positioning herself so her belly was visible. Pregnant women inspired either protection or dismissal. She needed to know which. You said this was about my husband's financial activities. Reed opened a file, spreading documents across the table. Bank statements, transaction records, copies of evidence she'd given the DA. We've been investigating offshore accounts connected to several prominent New York businessmen. Your husband's name appears in multiple transactions, raising questions about money laundering and fraud. Questions, not evidence. We're building a case, but we need cooperation from people close to him. Grace studied the agent carefully. Something felt wrong. What exactly are you asking? We'd like you to gather additional information. Phone records, computer files, anything documenting illegal activity. You want me to spy on my husband? We prefer to call it cooperation in an ongoing federal investigation. Grace leaned back. And what do I get in exchange? Protection. If you help us build a case, we can offer immunity from any charges arising from joint accounts or shared assets. I haven't committed any crimes, but you've benefited from them. Reed's tone sharpened. Every dollar you've spent came from fraud. A prosecutor could argue you were complicit. There it was. Not help, but a threat. Grace stood slowly. I think I need to speak with my attorney. You don't have an attorney, but Victor made sure of that. The words landed like a slap. This meeting wasn't about building a case against Victor. It was about intimidating her into silence. Who are you really working for? She asked quietly. Reed's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I'm a federal agent, Mrs. Ashford, a federal agent who seems very interested in making sure I don't cause problems for my husband. Grace moved toward the door. I won't be cooperating. That's a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Outside, Grace called Elliot immediately. The FBI agent is dirty. Thomas Reed, he's working for Victor. Elliot was quiet. You're sure he threatened me? Said I could be charged as complicit if I don't help Victor. Grace hailed a taxi. Victor owns more than judges. He owns federal agents. Then we can't trust official channels. New Year's Eve is our only shot. Elliot, what if it's not enough? Then we run. I've done it before. I can't run. Not 8 months pregnant. Then we make sure it's enough. His voice hardened. Isabel wears a wire tomorrow night. We get Victor on tape confessing. We record it, broadcast it, make it so public even his pet FBI agent can't bury it. How do we broadcast it? The gala's being live streamed for charity donors. We hack the feed, put Victor's confession on every screen in that ballroom. Grace closed her eyes. 300 of Manhattan's elite watching their golden boy reveal himself as a monster. That could work. Get some rest. Tomorrow night, we finish this. But rest was impossible. That afternoon, Grace's phone rang. Margaret Ashford, Victor's mother. Grace almost didn't answer. She and Margaret had never been close. But curiosity won. Grace, darling, I heard you were in the hospital. I wanted to check on you and the baby. We're fine. I also heard about the lawsuit and the custody filing. A pause. I need to speak with you. In person. Why? Because there are things you should know about my son. Things I should have told you years ago. They met at a West Village coffee shop. Margaret arrived in a car that cost more than most houses, wearing pearls and cashmere and the expression of someone who had made difficult decisions. I won't waste time, Margaret said. I know what Victor is. I've known for a very long time. Grace waited. His father was the same. Charming, brilliant, ruthless. I told myself Victor would be different, but some things are genetic. Or maybe I just failed. Why are you telling me this? Margaret met her eyes. Because I'm tired of covering for him. I've spent 50 years protecting my family's reputation, excusing behavior that should never be excused. When does it end? It ends when someone stops him. Yes. Margaret opened her purse, withdrew an envelope. These are account numbers for trusts Victor doesn't know exist. His grandfather set them up. If you need resources, legal fees, somewhere safe, use these. Grace took the envelope, stunned. Why are you helping me? Because you're carrying my grandchild. And I'll be damned if I let Victor destroy another generation. Margaret adjusted her purse. One more thing. The New Year's Eve gala, Victor has hired additional security. He knows something's coming. How do you know? Because I'm still his mother. He tells me things. Margaret stood. Be careful, Grace. Victor is most dangerous when he's cornered. After Margaret left, Grace opened the envelope. Inside were account numbers, passwords, and a note. For Emma, may she have the life I couldn't give my son. Emma. Grace hadn't told anyone the baby's name, but somehow Margaret knew. Grace called Elliot. We have a problem. Victor knows something's planned for tomorrow night. Then we change the plan, make it earlier, hit him before he's ready. How? Trust me, I'll handle it. That night, Grace dreamed of drowning. She woke gasping at 3 a.m., sheets soaked with sweat. New Year's Eve in 15 hours. Her phone buzzed with a text from unknown number. Courthouse, 9 a.m., emergency hearing. Victor's filing for immediate custody. He's claiming you're a danger to yourself and the baby. Grace read it 3 times, heart racing. The attack wasn't coming at the gala. It was coming in 6 hours. The courthouse looked like a fortress at dawn. Grace stood on the steps, one hand on her belly, clutching documents she'd organized all night. No lawyer, no support, just her and the truth. Elliot met her at security. The judge is Patricia Winters. She's got a reputation for not tolerating bullies. That's something. Grace, if this goes wrong, if Victor gets emergency custody, they could take the baby the moment she's born. I know. And there's something else. Elliot's voice dropped. Thomas Reed, the FBI agent, he's been on Victor's payroll for 3 years. Everything we planned for tonight, the wire, the live stream, Reed knows about it. Grace felt the floor tilt. How long? Isabel. She got scared last night, called Victor, told him everything. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. So we have nothing, Grace said flatly. We have this. Elliot held up a flash drive. Everything I've collected over 5 years, bank records, recordings, paper trails connecting Victor to fraud, attempted murder, 15 other felonies. It's not enough for an arrest, but it might stop the custody grab. Inside the courtroom, Victor sat with 3 attorneys, confident. The loving husband worried about his unstable wife. Grace took her seat alone. The optics were terrible. Pregnant woman without representation versus billionaire with an army of lawyers. Judge Patricia Winters entered. She was in her 60s, with gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen every trick. This is an emergency hearing regarding temporary custody of an unborn child. Judge Winters began. Mr. Ashford, present your evidence. Victor's lead attorney, Richard Sullivan, stood. Your Honor, Grace Ashford has demonstrated increasingly erratic behavior. She's made wild accusations, refused prenatal care, placed herself in dangerous situations. He presented hospital records Grace hadn't consented to release. Additionally, Mrs. Ashford has been living in an undisclosed location, refuses to communicate with her husband, and has associated with a known fugitive, Elliot Nash. Security moved toward Elliot, but Judge Winters raised a hand. Mr. Nash is not the subject of this hearing. Continue. Sullivan presented photographs. Grace entering the FBI office. Grace meeting Isabel. Every moment documented and twisted. We're asking for immediate temporary custody. The baby will be taken into state care upon birth, with Mr. Ashford designated as sole guardian. Judge Winters turned to Grace. Mrs. Ashford, you're not represented by counsel. No, Your Honor. My husband made it impossible for me to retain legal representation. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. I can provide documentation showing 8 attorneys declined my case after contact from Mr. Ashford's legal team. Your Honor, Sullivan interjected. This is exactly the paranoid thinking we're concerned about. I'll decide what I'm concerned about. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Winters looked at Grace. Do you have evidence to present? Grace stood, legs steadier than expected. Your Honor, I have evidence that my husband is involved in criminal activity, that he attempted to murder his business partner, and that this custody filing is part of a pattern of intimidation and control. She approached the bench, handing the flash drive to the clerk. This drive contains 5 years of documentation, bank records, audio recordings, witness statements. It proves Victor Ashford is not concerned about my stability. He's concerned about being exposed. Sullivan was on his feet. Your Honor, these are unsubstantiated accusations from a woman experiencing a mental health crisis. A crisis your client created. Grace shot back. He isolated me, controlled my access to money, threatened everyone who tried to help me. That's not concern. That's abuse. Judge Winters held up the flash drive. Is this evidence admissible in a criminal investigation? It could be, Your Honor, Grace said carefully. If investigated by someone not currently on my husband's payroll. The courtroom erupted. Sullivan demanded she be held in contempt. Judge Winters banged her gavel. Enough, Mrs. Ashford. These are extraordinary claims. Do you have anything that substantiates them right now? Grace felt the baby kick. This was it. I have a witness, someone who can testify to Victor's character and capacity for violence. Who? The courtroom doors opened. Margaret Ashford walked in, impeccably dressed, her expression carved from ice. Victor's face went pale. Your Honor, Margaret said clearly, I'm Margaret Ashford, the defendant's mother. I'm here to testify on behalf of Grace Ashford. The courtroom exploded. Sullivan tried to object. Judge Winters silenced him. Mrs. Ashford, you're prepared to testify against your own son? I'm prepared to tell the truth. Margaret took the witness stand, was sworn in. My son is not a safe guardian for a child. Victor half rose. Mother, what are you doing? What I should have done 30 years ago, stopping you. For 20 minutes, Margaret detailed decades of Victor's behavior, accusations buried with money, competitors destroyed through illegal means, the pattern of manipulation and violence. I enabled him, Margaret said quietly. I paid off victims, silenced witnesses, but he never changed. He only got better at hiding. Sullivan tried to discredit her, but Margaret was unshakable. She produced bank statements showing payments to Victor's victims, emails where Victor asked her to intimidate Grace's potential attorneys. I have spent 50 years protecting my family's reputation, Margaret concluded. But there comes a point where reputation is worth less than a child's safety. Judge Winters took a recess. Grace sat in the hallway, shaking. Elliot brought water. Margaret sat nearby, hands folded. Victor paced like a caged animal, his attorney's arguments growing heated. After an hour, they were called back. Judge Winters looked tired. I've reviewed the evidence on the flash drive. While much requires further investigation, there's enough to give me serious concerns about Mr. Ashford's character and motives. Victor's attorney stood. Your Honor, we're prepared to withdraw the emergency custody petition. Sit down, Mr. Sullivan. I'm not finished. Judge Winters turned to Victor. Mr. Ashford, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order. You are to have no contact with your wife until further proceedings. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation. Your Honor, Victor's voice strangled. This is based on uncorroborated testimony and illegally obtained evidence. This is based on my assessment that a pregnant woman needs protection. My ruling stands. She looked at Grace. Mrs. Ashford, I'm also ordering you to receive proper prenatal care, with regular check-ins from a court-appointed social worker. I understand, Your Honor. Good. We're adjourned. The gavel fell. Grace stood, legs barely supporting her. Elliot grabbed her elbow. Margaret approached Victor, said something quiet, then walked out without looking back. Victor stood alone, his perfect facade cracked beyond repair. Outside, Grace collapsed onto a bench. It's not over. You know that. I know, but you bought yourself time. Margaret appeared. Come with me, both of you. I have a house in Connecticut. You can stay there until the baby comes. Grace looked at this woman who had finally chosen redemption over reputation. Why are you doing this? Because I can't undo the past, but maybe I can protect the future. They left together, three broken people bound by Victor Ashford's wreckage. Behind them, Victor watched from the courthouse steps, phone pressed to his ear, already plotting his next move, because men like Victor never surrendered. They only regrouped. Margaret's Connecticut house sat on 20 acres behind iron gates. Grace stood in the guest room, looking out at snow-covered grounds. The room was elegant, comfortable, safe. Rest, Margaret said. Dr. Pierce will be here in an hour. After Margaret left, Grace lay on the bed, too wired to sleep. The baby moved lazily, sensing safety for the first time. Elliot knocked before entering. Your bodyguard's here. Margaret hired private security, former Secret Service. Victor will find us. Probably, but not tonight. Elliot sat by the window. Grace, after this is over, what are you going to do? I don't know. You should have options. He showed her his phone, a beach house in Costa Rica. No extradition treaty, low cost, good health care. I bought this 3 years ago. If things go wrong, you take Emma and disappear. The house is yours. Grace looked at the photo. I can't run forever. No, but you can run long enough for your daughter to grow up safe. Dame Pierce arrived, examining Grace thoroughly. Everything looks good. Blood pressure's almost normal. Baby's healthy. You're at 32 weeks. If you can make it to 37, we're in excellent shape. 5 more weeks. 5 more weeks of rest, low stress. Can you do that here? I think so. Over the next 3 days, Margaret's house became a war room. The attorney she'd hired, Elizabeth Warren, was sharp and aggressive. She arrived with associates and began building the custody case. Victor's filing emergency appeals, Elizabeth explained, arguing Judge Winters was biased, that you're using his mother against him. Can he win? Not if we bury him first. Elizabeth pulled up documents. Margaret's testimony was explosive, but we need more. Employees Victor wronged, partners he destroyed, victims he paid off. We need a pattern so clear no judge can ignore it. I can provide names, Margaret said. 20 years of people I paid to stay silent. They worked for days. Grace documented Victor's history with investigators. Margaret contacted victims, offering to release them from NDAs. Elliot built financial flowcharts showing exactly how Victor had stolen and hidden millions. On the 4th night, Victor found them. Grace was making tea when the security system blared. Lights flooded the grounds. Elliot pulled her from windows. He's at the gate, a security guard reported. Victor Ashford, alone, says he wants to talk to his wife. Tell him to leave, Margaret said coldly. He's violating the restraining order. He says if you don't let him in, he'll make a scene on every news channel by morning. They gathered in Margaret's living room, watching security footage. Victor looked disheveled, holding something small. Zoom in, Elliot ordered. Not a gun, an envelope. Grace walked to the security panel, pressed the intercom. Victor, his face appeared on screen, barely recognizable. The polished businessman was gone. Grace, thank God. I need to speak with you. 5 minutes, please. You're violating a restraining order. I know. I don't care. His voice cracked. My mother testified against me. You've turned everyone against me, taken everything. What more do you want? I want Emma to be safe from you. She's my daughter too. You can't keep her from me. I have rights. You forfeited your rights when you put your hands on my throat. Silence. Victor's face transformed. The desperation vanished, replaced by cold calculation. So that's how we're playing this. He held up the envelope. I have evidence that Elliot Nash didn't just survive. He sabotaged his own boat, faked his death, and has been embezzling for 5 years. I have everything I need to put him in prison for 20 years. You're lying. Ask him about the Cayman Islands account. Ask him where the money came from for that Costa Rica beach house. Grace's stomach dropped. She turned to Elliot, who had gone still. There is an account, Elliot said quietly. Money I moved before disappearing, to survive while hiding. I didn't steal it. I transferred my share of company assets before Victor could freeze me out. Money that now looks like embezzlement. Victor's voice came through. Money that makes Elliot look like a fugitive. The FBI has been very interested. Thomas Reed. Agent Reed has enough evidence to bring charges. Unless, Victor's smile was terrible, unless you drop the custody case, retract all accusations, and disappear with Elliot. Do that, and I'll make sure Reed loses the evidence. You get to live, raise Emma somewhere, I'll never find you. Except you get away with everything. I get to avoid prison and pretend my wife and child died tragically during childbirth. You get to live, fair trade. Grace pressed both hands against the wall. The baby kicked frantically. I need time to think. You have until New Year's Eve, tomorrow night at midnight, drop the case and disappear. Or I destroy Elliot and take Emma through legal channels that'll tie you up until she's old enough to vote. The screen went dark. Grace turned to face the room. Margaret looked devastated. Elizabeth was already on her phone. Elliot stood frozen. Tell me the truth, Grace said. All of it? I moved $8 million before disappearing. Legally gray area. Victor can make it look like embezzlement if he has the right prosecutor. Elliot's voice was flat. I should have told you. Grace walked to the window. We can fight this, Elizabeth said. Expose Reed's corruption. That takes time we don't have. Grace interrupted. I'm 33 weeks pregnant. In 4 weeks, Emma will be born. Victor's giving us a choice fight and lose everything. Or run and keep Emma safe. Running means Victor wins, Margaret said. He stays free, rich, powerful. But Emma stays safe. Does she? Elliot's voice was sharp. You think Victor accepts defeat? Running isn't safety. It's just a slower death. Grace pressed her forehead against cold glass. Tomorrow at midnight, Victor would demand her answer. New Year's Eve arrived with fresh snow. Grace woke at dawn, baby restless inside her. Margaret's house felt less like sanctuary, more like a holding cell. She found Elliot in the kitchen, staring at his laptop. Tell me there's a way out. I've been through every scenario. Victor's closed every exit. Elliot pushed the laptop away. If we fight the embezzlement charges, it takes months. By then Emma's born, and Victor files for custody claiming you're harboring a fugitive. And if I run 6 months before he finds us, maybe there has to be something. There is, Margaret entered. We give Victor what he wants. That's surrender. No, it's bait. Margaret's eyes were sharp. You publicly drop the custody case. Release a statement saying you were mistaken, emotional. Let him think he won. And then we destroy him. Elizabeth strode in, phone in hand. I've been on calls all night with the DA's office, the real FBI, and several journalists. Victor's blackmail only works if you're in court. The moment you file for custody, he uses Elliot's issues to destroy you. But if you're not in court, if you've publicly surrendered, he has no reason to pursue Elliot. He still wins. Only short term. Elizabeth showed them a timeline. You issue a statement today, withdrawing from custody battle, citing health concerns. Very defeated. Victor celebrates, relaxes, and while he's relaxed, the DA files criminal charges, not based on your accusations, but on independent investigation. Margaret's testimony, Elliot's evidence, statements from victims. The case doesn't need you as plaintiff because it's the state of New York versus Victor Ashford. Grace felt her heart spike. That could work. It will work, Margaret said. Victor's arrogant. He thinks he's invincible. The moment you surrender, he'll let his guard down. But Emma, what happens when she's born? By then, Elizabeth said, Victor will be under criminal indictment and facing charges that make custody impossible. Your statement goes out today. DA files tomorrow morning. By the time you deliver, Victor's fighting for his freedom. It was elegant, risky, the only plan that didn't end with running forever. What if he doesn't take the bait? He will, Margaret said quietly, because I know my son. Victory is more important to him than anything. The moment you surrender, he'll accept it and move on. Grace looked at each of them. Do it. Write the statement. Elizabeth's team crafted a statement that satisfied Victor's ego while preserving Grace's dignity. It acknowledged misunderstandings, expressed desire to focus on the baby's health, and withdrew all legal actions in the interest of family peace. It made Grace sick, but she signed it. At noon, the statement went live. The response was immediate. Victor's supporters cheered. Grace's phone exploded with messages. She waited for the only message that mattered. It came at 2 p.m. Unknown number. I accept your terms. Drop all charges, stay out of my life, and we'll discuss a visitation after Emma's born. Glad you came to your senses. Grace showed the team. He took the bait. Now we set the hook, Elizabeth said, dialing the DA. The DA was filing charges in the morning. Before Victor could realize what was happening, Judge Margaret Coleman would issue the arrest warrant. Grace spent the evening in Margaret's library, trying to read. The baby was active, kicking as if preparing for battle ahead. At 11 p.m., her phone rang. Dr. Pierce. Grace, Victor just admitted himself to the ER claiming chest pains. He's demanding you be brought in for immediate prenatal evaluation. It's a trap. I know, but he's surrounded by reporters. He's making a show of being a concerned father. If you don't come, it looks like you're being unreasonable. I'm not going. You don't have to. But he's positioning himself as the victim. Can you examine me there, at Margaret's document, that Emma and I are healthy? Already on my way. Dr. Pierce arrived, bringing portable equipment. She examined Grace while Elizabeth filmed for documentation. Blood pressure normal, baby's heartbeat strong. Grace Ashford and her baby are both healthy. There is no medical emergency. The video went live within minutes. At midnight, New Year arrived with fireworks. Grace stood watching them, one hand on her belly. At 12:01, the DA's office issued a press release. Criminal charges against Victor Ashford. Arrest warrant issued. At 12:05, Grace's phone rang. Victor. She let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes of incoherent rage. Accusations. Threats. Promises she would regret this. At 12:30, news broke that Victor had fled the hospital before police arrived. Last known location, a private airfield in Westchester. We need to move, Elizabeth said. If Victor's running, he's desperate. Margaret's security swept the house, finding nothing. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling Victor was coming. At 2 a.m., exhausted, Grace finally fell into fitful sleep. She woke at 4 a.m. to screaming alarms and breaking glass. The window exploded inward. Grace bolted upright, hard hammering. Footsteps pounded. Security alarms shrieked. Elliot burst through her door. Stay here. Lock this behind me. What's happening? Victor's here. Grace struggled out of bed, her belly making every movement awkward. Through her window, she saw security guards running, more breaking glass from downstairs. Elizabeth texted, police called. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes was a lifetime. Grace locked her door, pushed the dresser in front of it. The baby kicked frantically. Shouting erupted downstairs. Victor's voice, where is she? Margaret's voice, Victor, stop. The police are coming. I don't care, she destroyed me. More crashing. Grace dialed 911. My name is Grace Ashford. My husband Victor Ashford has broken in. He has a restraining order. He's violent. I'm 8 months pregnant. Please hurry. Officers are en route. Stay on the line. Are you in a safe location? I'm locked in a bedroom. But he's in the house. Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, determined. Grace for Victor outside her door. Open this door. She said nothing. Open the door. He slammed against it. The wood shuddered. The dresser scraped. Victor, stop. Elliot's voice. Police are 2 minutes away. Worse? How could it be worse? I'm facing 20 years because of her lies. They're not lies. You tried to kill me. You beat your pregnant wife. That's who you are. Silence. Then Victor laughed, devoid of sanity. If you just stayed dead. A gunshot split the air. Grace screamed. The baby went wild, kicking and turning. Elliot, Margaret's voice, shrill with panic. Another gunshot. Grace's door exploded inward. The lock shattering. Victor stood in the doorway, barely recognizable. Disheveled clothes. Wild hair. Eyes holding something broken and dangerous. Those were warning shots, Victor said, eerily calm. I told them to back off. Victor, please, think about Emma. Is she? Victor stepped into the room. Or is she Elliot's? The accusation was so absurd, Grace understood she was facing a man completely divorced from reality. She's yours, but she deserves better than you destroying everything. Consequences. Victor moved closer. Let me show you consequences. He grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her toward the door. She tried to resist, but her pregnant body was clumsy. Sharp pain radiated through her belly. Let her go. Margaret appeared in the doorway, holding a gun, old, from her father's collection, but steady. Victor, I will shoot you. Victor froze. Mother and son stared at each other. You would kill your own child, Victor asked. To protect my grandchild. Yes. Margaret's voice didn't waver. Let Grace go. Walk away. There's still a chance if you surrender now. Surrender. Victor released Grace. To what prison humiliation? To justice. To accepting responsibility. Justice. Victor spat the word. There's no justice for men like me. There's only power. And I'm not giving mine up. He moved suddenly toward Margaret. The gun fired. Victor stumbled, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. Margaret stood frozen, shocked at what she'd done. Police sirens screamed outside. Officers burst in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Victor was wrestled down, handcuffed, screaming threats. Paramedics checked Margaret, checked Victor's wound, checked Grace. Ma'am, we need to get you to the hospital. For the baby? Grace nodded numbly, helped onto a stretcher. In the hallway, Elliot was being treated for a head wound. Is he alive? Concussion. He'll be fine. In the ambulance, Grace lay staring at the ceiling, one hand on her belly. The baby had gone still, exhausted. At the hospital, Dr. Pierce was waiting. They hooked Grace to monitors. The baby's heartbeat was strong. You're in labor, Dr. Pierce said. When I'm only 33 weeks, your body's been through extreme stress. Contractions started about an hour ago. Can you stop it? I can try, but if your body is saying it's time, fighting might be riskier. 33 weeks is premature, but survivable. Babies born now have excellent outcomes with NICU support. Grace closed her eyes, tears sliding down her temples. I wanted her to have more time. She will be safe. You're in a hospital. And Victor, he's in custody, shot and handcuffed. He can't hurt either of you anymore. Over the next hours, contractions grew stronger. Dr. Pierce tried to slow labor, but Emma had decided it was time. Margaret arrived, clothes bloody, face aged overnight. I shot my son. The police say it was self-defense, but I shot him. You saved us. Grace said between contractions. Elizabeth arrived with updates. Victor had been taken from hospital to jail. Bail hearing scheduled. He's not getting out. He's going to prison. Grace, for a very long time. At 8:43 a.m. on New Year's Day, Emma Grace Ashford was born, 5 pounds, 3 ounces, with dark hair and impressive lungs. She's perfect, Dr. Pierce said, placing the tiny baby on Grace's chest. Small, but strong, just like her mother. Grace looked down at her daughter, at the tiny face and impossibly small fingers, and felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, relief, joy, overwhelming love. "Hi, Emma," she whispered. "We made it." Margaret stood nearby, crying quietly. In the hallway, Elliot waited with a bandage and soft smile. "She looks like possibility," Grace said, "like a future where none of this matters anymore." But even as she said it, Grace knew that wasn't true. Victor was alive, in custody, but alive. Still holding her daughter in the morning light, Grace allowed herself to believe the worst was over. 3 weeks passed in the NICU bubble. Emma thrived, gaining weight while Grace learned premature parenthood rhythms. Margaret visited daily, bringing coffee, sitting quietly watching Emma sleep. "The trial starts next week," Margaret said one morning. "Victor's attorneys are arguing I manipulated you, that everything was an elaborate scheme." "That's insane. It's his only defense. Paint himself as victim of conspiracy." Margaret's smile was bitter. The man cannot accept responsibility even when caught red-handed. The trial became a media sensation. The billionaire brought down by the wife he abused and the partner he tried to murder. On the day Grace testified, Margaret stayed with Emma. Elliot accompanied Grace to the courthouse. Security was intense. Victor's supporters protested outside. News cameras created a gauntlet. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Victor sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, thinner but still carrying arrogance. When Grace took the stand, their eyes met. She saw calculation, strategy. He wouldn't find weakness. Not anymore. The prosecutor walked her through the timeline, the isolation, the control. The moment Victor's hands closed around her throat. "Can you describe what happened on Christmas Eve?" Grace described it clearly, without emotion. The photograph, Victor's rage, the violence that followed. "And when he grabbed your throat, what went through your mind? That I was going to die, that my baby was going to die, and that if I survived, I would do whatever it took to make sure he never touched us again." Victor's attorney tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggested she'd fabricated evidence, manipulated Margaret, conspired with Elliot. "Isn't it true you were having an affair with Elliot Nash?" "No. You expect this court to believe you and Mr. Nash spent months plotting without romantic involvement?" "Yes, because it's the truth. A truth that conveniently paints you as victim and my client as monster." Grace leaned forward. "Your client put his hands around my throat while I was 8 months pregnant. He tried to kill his business partner. He bribed federal agents. I don't need to paint him as a monster. He is one." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Margaret testified next, detailing decades of enabling Victor's behavior. She produced records of payments to victims, emails shown in threats, the timeline of escalation. Elliot's testimony was devastating. 5 years of documentation showing Victor's fraud, his attempts to kill Elliot, his pattern of destroying anyone who threatened his empire. The defense called character witnesses, business associates who swore Victor was a philanthropist. But under cross-examination, several admitted receiving substantial payments from Victor's companies. The jury deliberated 4 days. Grace spent that time in the NICU, watching Emma grow stronger. "What happens if he's acquitted?" Grace asked Elizabeth. "He won't be. The evidence is overwhelming." The call came on a Wednesday. Verdict reached. Grace left Emma with Margaret and returned to the courthouse. Inside, silence with anticipation. The jury filed in. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of attempted murder of Elliot Nash, how do you find guilty?" Victor's composure cracked. "On the charge of fraud and racketeering, guilty. On the charge of assault and battery against Grace Ashford, guilty. 10 charges, 10 convictions, each one another nail in Victor's coffin. When the foreman finished, the courtroom erupted. Victor sat frozen, staring at the jury box. The judge looked at Victor. "Mr. Ashford, you've been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for 3 weeks. Until then, you'll remain in custody without bail." Victor stood slowly. For a moment, Grace thought he might speak. Instead, he looked directly at her, not with rage, but with something else. Recognition that he'd finally met an opponent he couldn't destroy. Then he was led away. Outside, reporters swarmed. Grace made a brief statement. "Justice was served today. My daughter and I can finally start building a life free from fear." She returned to the hospital, to Emma, to the future that was finally possible. 3 weeks later, Victor was sentenced to 25 years. Margaret attended but didn't speak. Afterward, she told Grace she'd arranged for Victor's assets to be liquidated, with proceeds going to his victims. "I can't undo what he did, but I can try to make restitution." Emma was 6 weeks old when Grace brought her home, not to the penthouse, but to a modest Connecticut house Margaret had purchased in Grace's name. 3 bedrooms, a yard, good schools, the kind of house where children could grow up safely. Elliot helped them move in. When everything was unpacked, he stood in the doorway. "I should go. Let you settle." "Where will you go?" "Not sure yet. Maybe Costa Rica. Time to figure out how to stop running." "You could stay, Connecticut, be part of Emma's life." "I'd like that." That night, after everyone left, Grace sat alone in the dark living room. On the mantel was a photograph of her and Emma at the beach, both laughing, her favorite because neither looked haunted. She thought about Victor's transformation, if real, but it didn't matter. His change was for him. She didn't need it for peace. Her phone lit up with a message from the support group she'd started. One woman had just left her abuser and needed advice. Grace typed back practical information. Resources, encouragement. Will it get better? Yes, not immediately, not easily, but yes. This was what she did now. She helped others find courage she'd barely found in herself. At midnight, unable to sleep, Grace went to Emma's room and sat in the rocking chair. Her daughter slept peacefully, completely trusting in a world Grace had fought to make safe. She pulled out her phone and wrote, "Survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. What comes after matters as much as escape itself. Building a life worth living, learning to trust again, raising a child who will never know the fear you knew. That's the real victory." Grace saved the note, put her phone away, and sat watching her daughter breathe. Outside, Connecticut was quiet. Inside, the house was warm and safe in theirs, somewhere in prison. Victor served his sentence, somewhere nearby. Margaret had stopped carrying guilt. Across town, Elliot slept without dreaming of drowning. And here, in this modest house, Grace Ashford finally felt at home. 6 months passed before Grace stopped checking locks twice. A year before loud noises didn't make her flinch. 18 months before she realized a whole week had gone by without thinking about Victor. Emma grew from fragile NICU baby into a sturdy toddler who laughed easily and explored fearlessly. She had Grace's dark hair and stubborn independence. Margaret moved next door, claiming she needed to downsize but really wanting to be close to Emma. She babysat 3 days a week while Grace completed her law degree online. Slow progress between naps and meals, but Grace was determined to help other trapped women. Elliot rented an apartment in town and started a consulting business. He had dinner with them twice weekly, more uncle than friend, teaching Emma to count and reading stories about brave children solving impossible problems. On a Saturday, when Emma was 2, Grace received a letter from the prison. She almost threw it away, but something made her read it. Victor's handwriting was neater now. "Grace, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm writing because I need you to know something. I understand now what I was. The therapist calls it narcissistic personality disorder. My attorney would have used it as defense if I'd let him, but I didn't want excuses. I've spent 2 years trying to understand how I became the kind of man who put his hands on his pregnant wife. The answer is I chose cruelty because it gave me control, and control mattered more than truth, love, or being human. I'm told Emma is beautiful, healthy, happy. Margaret sends photos sometimes. I don't deserve them, but I'm grateful. Tell her when she's old enough that her father was a monster who became a man too late to matter. But tell her also that monsters can be made and unmade, and the choice belongs to each of us. You won. Completely. I hope that brings you peace. Grace read it twice, then put it in the fireplace. She watched it burn. Part of her wanted to believe Victor's introspection was real, but a larger part knew some damage was too profound for redemption. What was that? Margaret asked, appearing with Emma. Nothing important, just ghosts. That evening, they had a small party in the backyard. Dr. Pierce came. Elizabeth brought her twins Emma's age. Elliot grilled with Margaret supervising. Emma chased Bubbles, shrieking with joy. Grace watched from the porch, wine warming in her hand, and tried to remember when this stopped feeling temporary, when she'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Happy? Elliot asked, joining her. Getting there. It's been 2 years since the trial. Victor's appeals have all failed. He's not coming back. I know, but trauma doesn't listen to logic. Elliot nodded. I still dream about drowning sometimes. Then I wake up and remember I survived, that I'm here, alive, safe. Does it get easier? Slowly, then all at once, he gestured at Emma, laughing. One day you realize you've built something so far from what you escaped that the past finally feels like the past. Emma ran over, demanding to be picked up. Grace scooped her, swinging in a circle until both were dizzy. They ate hamburgers while sunset behind trees. After dinner, Emma climbed into Grace's lap, thumb in mouth. Grace rocked gently, humming. Tell me a story, Emma mumbled, half asleep. What kind? One where the princess wins. Grace smiled. Once upon a time, there was a princess trapped in a tower by a dragon who pretended to be a prince. The dragon was very clever and very cruel, and everyone believed he was a prince because his scales sparkled like gold. But the princess was clever too. She found friends, a wise grandmother, a brave knight who had been hurt by the dragon before, and together they showed everyone what the dragon really was. And when the dragon was defeated, the princess didn't need a prince at all. She built her own castle, raised her own child, and lived happily. Did the dragon die? No, but he was locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Good, Emma yawned. I like that story. Grace carried her inside, tucked her into bed with butterfly sheets, watched her sleep. She thought about all the choices that led here. The decision to confront Victor, the courage to accept help, the strength to keep fighting when it seemed hopeless. Back outside, Margaret and Elliot were cleaning up. I'm proud of you, Margaret said suddenly. I know I don't say it enough. I couldn't have done it without you. Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to. Later, after everyone left, Grace sat alone in darkness. On the mantel was her favorite photo, her and Emma at the beach, both laughing at something off camera. Her phone lit up with a message from the support group. One woman had just left her abuser and needed help. Grace typed back resources, encouragement. You're not alone anymore. This was her purpose now. Not revenge, not even justice, but rescue. Throwing ropes to drowning women and pulling them towards shore. The next morning was Sunday. Grace woke to Emma jumping on her bed, singing. They made waffles, got syrup everywhere, headed to the park where Elliot was meeting them. Emma ran ahead on the path. Grace and Elliot walked behind. I'm thinking about going back to school, Elliot said. Teaching, business ethics. Grace smiled. That's perfect. You'd think it's strange, the guy who faked his death teaching ethics. I'd think it's perfect. You learn the hard way what happens when ethics are abandoned. That makes you the ideal teacher. They reached the playground where Emma had already made friends. The two toddlers shrieked with laughter, chasing each other. She's happy, Elliot observed. She is, and she doesn't carry our trauma. That's what I'm most proud of. That night, Grace received an email from the literary agent she'd contacted. I love what you've written. This could help thousands of women. Let's talk about publication. Grace read it 3 times, disbelief giving way to excitement. Her story would become a book. Her experience would reach beyond individual messages to become a guide. Proof that escape was possible. She called Margaret. Someone wants to publish my book. Of course they do. It's brilliant. It's necessary. Grace went to Emma's room. Her daughter was asleep, clutching her rabbit. Grace sat on the bed's edge, running gentle fingers through dark curling hair. I'm writing this for you too, Grace whispered. So when you're older, you'll know your mother wasn't perfect, wasn't fearless, but fought anyway. So you'll know strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being terrified and choosing courage anyway. Emma stirred, mumbling about butterflies, then settled. Grace returned to her office and pulled up the manuscript. What had started as therapy had become something larger. A testimony, a weapon against men who counted on victims staying silent. She wrote through the night. By dawn, she'd added 3 new chapters. When morning came, Emma padded into the office in butterfly pajamas. Mommy, you didn't sleep. I was working on something important. More important than pancakes. Grace laughed, scooping her daughter up. Nothing is more important than pancakes with you. They made breakfast together, Emma chattering about butterflies. Grace listened, present in the moment, no longer haunted by past or anxious about future. This was healing. Not absence of scars, but ability to live fully despite them. The book was published 10 months later. Grace did interviews, speaking carefully about Victor without making him the center. The focus was survival, recovery, the networks that made escape possible. The book sold well. Grace donated proceeds to shelters and legal funds. She started speaking at events, connecting with survivors, building a community of women who refused to be defined by what had been done to them. On Emma's 3rd birthday, they had a party in the backyard. 20 children ran wild. Margaret supervised games. Elliot manned the grill. Dr. Pierce brought presents. Grace stood on the porch watching chaos unfold with joy and realized she couldn't remember the last nightmare about Victor. The trauma had become part of her history rather than her present. A woman approached, mid-30s, nervous hands, eyes holding familiar fear. I'm Sarah. I read your book. I'm where you were 3 years ago. Grace's heart clenched. Are you safe right now? For today, he thinks I'm at my sister's. Come inside. Let's talk. They went to Grace's office. For the next hour, Grace listened to Sarah's story. Different details. Same pattern. How did you find the courage to leave? Sarah asked. I didn't find courage. I found I had no choice. Stay and die, or leave and maybe survive. When those are your options, courage becomes irrelevant. By the time Sarah left, she had numbers for 3 shelters, contact for an attorney, and Grace's personal cell. Call me anytime. 2 a.m., doesn't matter. You're not alone. Sarah's eyes filled. Thank you. After Sarah left, Grace returned to the party. Emma was showing friends the butterfly garden they'd planted. Elliot was teaching older kids to throw football. Margaret was dispensing wisdom to other parents. This was Grace's empire now. Not money or power, but this network of love and safety and women helping women climb toward freedom. That night, after guests left and Emma was asleep, Grace sat on the porch with Margaret and Elliot. They shared wine and comfortable silence, watching fireflies. Do you ever wonder what Victor's doing? Elliot asked. No, Grace said honestly. I used to, but I don't anymore. He's become irrelevant. That's growth, Margaret said softly. True healing is when the person who hurt you becomes just another person. Not a monster, not a victim, just someone who made choices you survived. He's still a monster, but he's not my monster anymore. He's locked away, and I'm here, and that's all that matters. They sat in peaceful quiet as stars emerged. Inside, Emma slept safely. Around them, Connecticut breathed with summer sounds. And for the first time since that Christmas Eve years ago, Grace felt completely, entirely at peace. The next morning, Grace received news that Victor's appeal for early release had been denied. He would serve his full sentence, 25 years. Grace read the notification and felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, just neutral acknowledgement of information that no longer had power over her. She deleted the email and took Emma to the butterfly sanctuary they visited monthly. They walked through netted gardens while monarchs and swallowtails danced around them. Mommy, why do butterflies fly away? Emma asked. Because they're not meant to be kept. They're meant to be free. Like us, Grace smiled. Yes, baby, exactly like us. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep exhausted. Grace glanced at her in the rearview mirror. This fierce little person who would grow up knowing safety as birthright rather than miracle. At home, Grace opened her laptop. The agent wanted a second book. Grace knew exactly what to write. Not memoir, but handbook. Practical steps for leaving, rebuilding, parenting through trauma. The book she wished had existed when she was 8 months pregnant with $47 and nowhere to go. Grace began to type. Chapter 1, you are not crazy, but he wants you to think you are. Words flowed easily, born from experience and hard-won wisdom. She wrote about gaslighting, isolation, the moment you realize leaving might kill you, but staying definitely will. By dinner, Grace had written 20 pages. Raw, honest, truth that could save lives. Margaret arrived with takeout. You're writing again. I'm writing the book I needed 4 years ago. Then thousands of women will be grateful. 5 years after that Christmas Eve, Grace finished her second book. She dedicated it to Emma, Margaret, Elliot, Dr. Pierce, to every woman who chose survival over surrender. Emma, now 5, gave a speech at the launch party. My mommy is very brave. She helps people who are scared. I'm proud of her, Grace cried. Of course, Margaret cried. Even Elliot got misty. That night, Grace sat in Emma's room watching her sleep. Tomorrow they would start kindergarten, the next chapter in a life Grace had fought to make possible. We did it, Grace whispered. We surveyed. We're happy. We're free. Emma stirred, mumbled, love you, Mommy, and settled back into dreams. Grace stood, turned out the light, and went to her own room. On her nightstand sat both published books, proof that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that victims could become advocates, that survival was just the beginning. She thought briefly of Victor, locked in his cell. She felt neither pity nor hatred, just distant acknowledgement that he existed somewhere, irrelevant to her happiness. Grace climbed into bed and fell asleep within minutes. No nightmares, no checking locks, just deep, peaceful sleep. Because this was what victory looked like. Not revenge, not even justice. Though both had been served, victory was the ability to sleep soundly, to raise a joyful child, to help other women find their way out of darkness. Victory was building a life so full of light that shadows couldn't reach it anymore. And Grace Ashford had won.